So that's great. Thank you for the introduction. We're so pleased to be here. The SERC funding enabled us to fund a really expansive and exciting and amazing kind of rolling public conversation. We're characterizing it as a rolling public think tank about all aspects of AI. So we're really appreciative of this funding. I'm going to get us started. I want to ask, how many of you, raise your hand if you were consulted about ChatGPT? Yeah, we were not consulted. Nobody was consulted. And this is actually part of the problem, right? And so this is part of the motivation for our original proposal, which, as you'll see, we actually have diverged significantly, but we remain focused on these questions of participation and voice and who gets a say in which product, which AI products are built, how they're built, who they benefit and who they harm. And so, we came to this work. I'm from the Data Feminism Lab. So there's a lab in Department of Urban Studies and Planning. And what we do is we are interested in the intersection of, on the one hand, racial justice and gender justice. But we think about how do we use data, computation, and AI in the service of those goals. And in the past, we have actually done a lot of work in participatory AI. So in fact, we have co-designed AI systems with citizen data scientists who are working on gender-based violence, particularly in Latin America. I have a book about this if you're interested. And it's been an amazing learning process over the past 5 years to be co-developing AI tools aligned with the visions of feminist activists working to really transform their worlds. But these kind of participatory methods are not mainstream. And certainly not mainstream in AI development. So what we wanted to do is to think about how can we create a framework for this sort of mainstreaming work. And so that's why the original title is A Framework for Participatory Methods and Community Engagement Across the AI ML Pipeline. And so these were original research questions. This is what we submitted in our proposal. How can AI and machine learning projects integrate methods from participatory action research, from participatory design? How can we use AI development and this participatory process to uplift rather than extract community knowledge? What are the epistemic and ethical obligations of AI and machine learning projects that undertake participation and civic engagement in this development process? But I think one of the things I want to ask you to note about these research questions is that their scale of analysis is already inside a pipeline of technical development, which is to say, outside of these questions, there has already been a decision to develop a technology. There have already been questions around, and the questions now are more about how do we integrate communities into this thing that we are already building. We've already decided this thing will be useful in the world. And I ask you to note that because this is exactly where we ran into issues and where we really wanted to pivot, because we realized if we wanted to actually build AI and machine learning that modeled pluralistic methods and supported integrating community needs and community knowledge, we actually needed to expand the scale of our inquiry. And we needed to do more systems thinking. We needed to think outside of just the pipeline of technical development. But first, Nikko's going to tell you about our first foray into this literature review of participatory methods in AI development, which are increasingly being talked about. So
they are. Hi, everyone. So very quickly, because we're in urban planning, we started with the classic Arnstein's ladder of participation, thinking of how people can get involved in the AI ML pipeline. And we came across what I've come to call sort of geometries of participation. There's the ladder, there's the cube, there are scales, there are all these ways to shuttle people from ideation through deployment or maintenance, still within this AI system. And ways to measure, right, their participation in the system and even their own level of satisfaction. Did they feel agential? Did they feel like they were respected and consented through the process? But I think, like Catherine was saying, we're still working within inside of the technical pipeline, and my own training comes as a software engineer. I worked in industry for many years, and my training was to be a systems thinker. And when there are problems in the pipeline, to kind of step back and step back and step back and step back until I could see a big enough picture to understand what the problems were. And so to me, coming from my own background, even in industry, thinking about, well, can I add participants to make more ethical, just felt insufficient. And so we started to ask a different question, which is, under what conditions are people and communities able to meaningfully participate in the creation, evaluation, and governance of AI? And I think, like Catherine said, this takes the focus. None of us got asked if ChatGPT should be built. And so creation is also a really important part of this question, right? Are we building AI that you want? Should we build this at all? So we didn't intend to build a think tank, but we did. And we gathered researchers from all of these institutions and more. And I think most importantly, we gathered 25 of us from all of these disciplines. So we have early career graduate students, master's, first and second year PhD students, all the way to full professors in all of these disciplines. And we're all having this conversation together. And some of them are practitioners. We have lawyers, we have studio artists. And so we're thinking of the project as liberatory AI. And you'll notice in this animation, AI continues to change. Across our disciplines, we couldn't even really agree on a working definition of AI, and that felt important and generative. And so we didn't. We're thinking about all of the things that AI can stand for. And we're talking in three ways: about corporate AI, about the dead ends within a corporate AI ecosystem, and about ways forward both through and out of corporate AI. The design by one of our master students, Alicia Delgado. And we collectively and individually wrote about 20 position papers. These are short, they're accessible, but they engage with all of the most current academic literature. They're up on a website that is live now. And so we're thinking about ways for both practitioners and community members and people across disciplines to really be thinking about the systems under which we can meaningfully participate. And also I want to mention, not all the pieces really even agree with each other, and we find that to be really important. So really quickly, thinking about the corporate AI landscape, this landscape in which we've got billion-dollar global tech oligarchs setting the terms of our engagement. Isa Krushin at Queen Mary wrote about how corporate AI can provoke threats to democracy. I think we're seeing some of that in current events right now. Amelia and Hongjin wrote about AI being placeless. And they give these examples of these systems trained to identify plant life from across the globe, right? The AI sits somewhere, the object of study sits somewhere else. Or generative AI being asked to generate images of cities, but all the cities kind of look the same, even though most of us can understand how cities look different from each other. Yuja, who's a CS student at Brown, talks about how in corporate AI, a corporation might market an AI system as being very performant, increasing the performance, but the AI system sets those benchmarks. They're not set by the communities in which the AI is used or tested. We're thinking also about dead ends, about all of these ways that corporate AI, not to make it sound too menacing, but sort of tricks us into thinking that we can engage in ways that might reduce harm or might be more ethical. And so we're working on projects to think about toolkitification. Richmond Wong has this wonderful idea about toolkitification being this seductive way to think maybe we're making a difference. Thinking about the responsibility gap at AI systems claiming to take responsibility for the harms that they cause, but maybe not actually doing so in practice. And always thinking about AI audits and whether those are the most effective ways to engage with systems. I want to spend the most time on ways forward because I think it feels hopeful and optimistic amidst a lot of critique. And our ways forward are not these like one-to-one solutions. We're not saying this over here is a problem and this over here is a solution, but rather we can reject these terms entirely and simply think about ways forward. And those ways forward might include small and open source models, laptop scale, right? Compute that we own, that we can repair, that we have access to. It definitely includes community data governance, community data stewardship, and community model ownership. where communities can set the terms of their engagement with that technology. And it includes community-driven benchmarks, where communities get to decide if AI is working for them, if a particular model is working for them, and what the repercussions might be if those models are not a good fit. And then quickly, a couple of instances of really wonderful AI that is sort of working in this way already that some of our members have pointed out. So the Igbo speech platform that is starting to make Igbo language available to programs like Duolingo, so preserving indigenous language and making indigenous language more available. Ways that people are thinking about how to make resource-intensive AI work in harmony with those who are stewarding our environment. So thinking about frugal computing, thinking about water cooling systems, thinking about other ways to make data centers more performant and easier on the planet. And programs and projects like Wikibench, where people are community curating the data that AI models are being trained on using open source corpora, using open source and community-based methods. Back to Catherine.
Sure. So yeah, we just wanted to wrap this up by saying that we would see this project, we see it as a rolling public dialogue. That's why we're calling it a kind of a think tank. We're not necessarily giving answers. We're not even necessarily agreeing with each other, but we're coming together to dialogue and debate about both problems, dead ends, and ways forward. And so we think about this as an invented space of citizenship. So this builds on very famous planning scholar Faranek Miraftab. She has this notion of invited versus invented spaces of citizenship. And so instead of waiting right now for OpenAI or for Google or for Meta to invite us in to participate on their terms on the products they deem worthy to build and invest in, then this group of us, and then maybe all of you, because you're all invited to be with us as well, we came together here to sort of contest the status quo and to be able to think larger thoughts, be able to think thoughts that help us reorganize resources in this AI system, to recognize that the organization of resources structurally, it was having all of these harmful downstream effects. And so how do we sort of think about reorganizing those right now? So think about how do we rearrange those resources in hope of a larger societal transformation, and always in a way with a belief that we can and should build systems that work for all of us, right? And so here we are for next steps, where this is going. This project, we've kind of started a snowball that keeps going. This project doesn't seem to be ending anytime soon. It keeps accruing new members. New people keep joining us, which has been really fascinating. So now it's going to be a partnership between Smith College, where Nikko is headed next year as an assistant professor, and MIT. Then we're thinking of pitching it as an edited volume to like an academic trade crossover book. So there might be like a kind of a book that emerges from this. And then continuing our rolling public think tank. We have bi-weekly meetings. We do a lot of reading and discussion. We invite people to come and present their work, and we all discuss it together. We're also thinking about doing public workshops. We really want to get students involved, in particular students in computer science, students in these more sort of technical disciplines, to think about what are some of these really interesting problems even as a research space. Like, how do we build small models? How do we do distributed model development? How do we have sovereignty over our AI models, and so on and so forth? I think actually these are really interesting socio-technical research questions, and be great to involve students sort of at the beginning. And then, yeah, you're invited. So it's a very open project, and we invite you all, and you just have to email Nikki. That's the way to get started. And so just to close out, we want to thank everyone who's joined the project so far. These are all the folks who we're in community with in this think tank. And then many, many thanks to SERC for making this possible. We didn't really know what the output doesn't look like the output that we thought we would get, but I think that's actually the best result of a pluralistic process. So thank you.
Thank you, Nikko. Catherine, questions?
Thank you so much for the talk. I'm so excited by this idea. I am curious to know, it seems like a lot of the folks involved in the think tank are folks from higher education. So is there any intention to involve stakeholders outside of this realm of higher education, which is a bit of a self-selecting group?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question. It's 100% a self-selecting group. I think, yes, the short answer is yes, absolutely. I think the longer answer is, how do we engage folks who maybe don't want to do readings with us or want to be, we need to meet them where they are. We've run out of funding, right? And so we've spent the money. And what I don't want to bring in people who want to be compensated, right? We get paid to be here, all of us academics. We get paid to read together. And it feels really extractive to ask a community member to come and be here on their free time. And so I think if we get money to compensate people for their participation, right, in meaningful ways, absolutely.
Thanks for the talk. You mentioned that not everybody agreed on everything when you guys were meeting together. So were there any disagreements you found especially productive or learned something from?
I think one of the things that we've been finding funny is we all have I would say a fraught relationship with AI. But that comes for different reasons, and it's also to different degrees. So there are people who have participated in the project who would characterize themselves as, I think, AI refusers. So they actually refuse to engage. They from an ethical standpoint, they don't use ChatGPT. They're not trying to incorporate anything with AI or generative AI sort of in their lives or whatever. So they're kind of these really kind of extreme sort of refusal standpoints, which I think is interesting. And there's actually a really interesting long literature on refusal, not just as a no, right, but actually as a generative position. So we've incorporated contributions from folks who are kind of in that realm of things to say if you refuse, it also begs the question of can we refuse? I mean, literally, can we opt out at this point? I'm not sure, right? And so that has been interesting and provocative. I'm trying to think of what else. I think one of the things that's been really interesting is to be in dialogue, and one of the things we've been careful to try to structure is around that disciplinary diversity, because we didn't want to have people from purely outside of a development space, non-developers outside who have never, say, built an application, or they've never trained a model or something like that, kind of being those stone throwers, you armchair critique and you throw stones from outside. So we have tried to structure the dialogue in such a way that we're having generative conversations from inside, from literally students that are PhD students, professors of computer science, and outside, so that we're colliding some of these disciplines, I think in very productive ways, and also bridging some of the language gaps that often prohibit us from speaking to each other, even the same language. I don't know if you can think of other.
No, yeah. I think that's right. The one thing I will add is, to the point of being in community with developers, all of my research and scholarship comes out of my own career as a software engineer, and it's really important to me to remember that working AI developers can't refuse AI, right? They have such a limited range of choices, and that I want that to always be in conversation with us.
This is maybe the other end of the spectrum, but it gets at the insider-outsider idea. As I've been doing this research and been kind of fascinated by some of the biggest AI development companies, OpenAI, Google, one of the things you learn is those are really big, well-funded companies and with very diverse employees with lots of different attitudes. And I've encountered in different contexts, I think, a number of employees at companies like that who I think would be interested and supportive of the work that you're doing, are working on some really interesting versions of trying to align their product and their models with the mission, with democratic governance, that sort of thing. I also think anybody who's looked at the history of business would question whether those recommendations or those initiatives will survive an era where at some point the venture capitalists are going to expect those companies to be profitable too. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are about engaging with people inside the big tech companies who are doing work that might be interesting or exciting or might be aligned with the work that you're doing.
Yeah, no, 100%. And actually, none of the current contributors, right, are corporate researchers, right? Yeah. No, so none of the current contributors are. But I will say one of my most generative events that I participated in the past year was an event that brought together industry researchers and scholars to think about cultural inclusion and generative AI. And it was fascinating to understand some of the constraints, but also to understand some of the opportunities. And I agree with you that there is alignment, and certainly at the researcher to researcher level, I think there is alignment, and I think there's some opportunity there. What we would, I think, call attention to, so what we're saying with like corporate AI is that's not like a judgment on somebody that works in a corporation. MIT is a corporation. So, you know, like there's not like some kind of like purity critique there or something like that. But more to say exactly what you just said, which is that the structures, again, the allocation of resources, the way that resources are arranged in a corporate model favors the production and decisions around certain kinds of products being made to serve certain kinds of populations. Meanwhile, there's a whole space over here, and that's a space that I've often worked in, is sort of community technology, feminist technology, human rights technology. There are all these sort of application areas that never get built for because they are not profitable. There's simply no business model. And so like the question there is like, is that who we want the tech to serve? That's a real asymmetry in innovation. And so how do we do it differently? How do we structure things differently to produce different products and different outcomes? Yeah.
And I guess my question actually relates somewhat to what you just outlined. Is as a think tank, what is your long-term goal?
Yeah.
And what is the short-term goal? And how do you sustain yourself? Because just now you're saying that the funding is running out. And how do you sustain yourself to achieve that kind of goal? And I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, we want to know the answer too.
Yeah, if you have the answer, that would be great.
I don't know if you want
I mean, I think like the most honest answer is like I have some startup funding from my new professorship, and some of that will go to maintaining this, and then we're going to write some grants and hope for the best. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what these projects end up being is chained funding. You kind of like hope to get the next grant, and you hope to move to the next grant. But I mean, at a certain point, maybe with enough sort of structure and participation, we could figure out like a longer-term strategy, and actually work on a longer-term plan, and then seek a like slightly more stable funding. So I like that idea. But it's in formation. I would say it's an emerging think tank.
Hi, I'm very appreciative to hear this kind of like, information about like sharing the community model and the feminist model, and also help with the data infrastructure. Yeah. The questions like actually, some of us are actually not students or like researchers, but we are MIT staff and also utilize AI and also building pipelines. Yeah. So. My colleague and I, we are very interested to join and also witness, and also I know like MIT is having new ERP system implementing in the following like 5 to 10 years, and I'm looking forward to see if anything we can work together if possible. Yeah.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Please.
Thank
Send
you.
me an email.
Please join us. Yeah. We already have several folks who are not inside academia as like professors or students. So there are already folks who are practitioners who have joined it. Yeah.
That would be wonderful. Thanks.
Great.
Okay, let's thank Nikko and Catherine again.
Thank you.